How would you characterize the relationship between political parties and civil society, especially on the campaign trail? Was it a healthy tension? Was it deeply hostile, where some NGOs are moving towards sabotaging particular political parties? And are they responsible for the decline in numbers of particular political parties? You can weigh in tonight, 072-110-5584. We hope to get to those questions tonight. I'm joined by Advocate Stefanie Fick from Outa on that conversation. Advocate, good to have you, and thank you very much for coming on this evening. When you look at the role of civil society retaining their independence, because they've got to then come back and speak to whatever government that is there, and bring correction. So they want to maintain that independence without really entering into the enterprise of politics. Do you think there was a balance there in maintaining that healthy tension? Or, as they put it, were civil society organizations responsible for the decline in performance of some political parties?
Let me start with the second half. I think political parties do not need civil society's help to make sure that their own numbers decline. I think the reason why there's a decline in numbers is the fact that people just realize that service delivery aren't there. Corruption is an illness in South Africa that is causing havoc across communities. The amount of money we lose to corruption, we could build so many schools, so many access to water, et cetera, et cetera. I think healthy, healthy dialogue and healthy competition, or is good, because I do believe that we are. I think you've mentioned that civil society is sort of the last barrier, for political parties just creating havoc. So there needs to be, I think, a little bit tension. Someone needs to hold them to account. And I think we are the last resort. If we just, as an example, if you look at state capture, if it wasn't for journalists that exposed the corruption, civil societies that, made sure that there was some type of accountability and exposing the rot, and then your independent judiciary are sort of the pillars. And I think civil society started to realize that, we now have a democratic South Africa. We are a young democracy, but we cannot be caught asleep at the wheel, that we are necessary in order to hold the politicians to account.
There are some who've been taken aback by actions of particular civil society groups. By those actions I'm in. One, funding of political parties is one that has certainly been raised. Two, joining court challenges that include particular political parties and, for example, in institutions like the IEC. Thirdly, others who downright, for example, would have voiced their interest in joining the Moonshot Pact. I keep on forgetting its proper name, and I apologize for that. These are things that they're looking at, and they're saying, look, civil society are supposed to really be supporting the institutional processes of a democratic election, not actually jumping in and being a part of it.
Let's look at it, and let's analyze it for a bit. I don't know about civil society getting involved in the Moonshot Pact or whatever you wanna call it, because that's getting involved in politics. I was at a conference once, and a very wise man, when I said we are apolitical, he said, you'll never be apolitical. You might be non-partisan, because we live in a political space. Everybody, whether you hate politicians or not, you live in a political space, but you're not non-partisan. And I think that the majority of civil activist organizations are just that. What their mandates are usually, we need to make sure that there's education for children. And if that means getting into the ring with government or political parties, that is what they will have to do. Because I do think that, not just political parties, but also government in certain instances has let us down. If you look at Parliament, do they hold the executive to the account as they should? Now with elections around the corner, we hear, so many promises. And I firmly believe that if all the promises that political parties make just in the week before elections, we will live in utopia. Everybody would have jobs, everybody would have money in order to buy whatever they need. Getting involved in certain legal actions, I do believe is in some instances, that civil society is obliged. For example, the whole electoral court that said, gave judgment with regards to Zuma's sentence or not. That type of judgment has got an impact on, the judiciary and case law, etc., etc. And then for some civil activist organizations to get involved is not about the politics. It is about what is right and what is wrong. And I think really on behalf of civil society is that, if we have to agree with, certain rhetoric, because it's in the best interest of a democratic South Africa, that is what we will do. If we need to go into conversations with politicians in order to establish a better South Africa, a better working South Africa for all, that is what we will do. But I think what, as civil society, we take extremely serious is our independence, and that, you give compliments where compliments are due, but you will get into the ring and fight if that is needed.
So a court challenge like that, do you think it threatens that independence in a sense where people then, if MK party wins in KwaZulu-Natal, for example, and Outa tomorrow has got to deal with that party, and the party can turn around and say, well, you've never really been an impartial player when it comes to this organization and its leadership. You even took us to court.
What I want to say is that you will get that type of rhetoric always. It is in whose best interest is that line, and sometimes the sort of the sore losers will always have something to say. I think as civil society we're used to criticism because you play in that field. You are there. For example, Outa as an organization, we can talk for hours about the criticism we have heard in the past. And that is most probably the nature of what we all do. In any space, you'll probably get, two sides. The one side think he's right and the other side think he's right. I sometimes think we do play in the space where we have the ability in order to fight for what is right and not necessarily vote in terms of party lines. If you catch what I'm saying, it is not for a specific political view. It is more for the interest of the people. And I think that civil society in most cases, have been successful in trying to look after the interests of people instead of, the civil society's interest as a rule.
So would you say, I've remembered now, it's called the Multi-Party Charter for South Africa. Participating in a multi-party charter for South Africa by civil society would be a no-no for you? Because you'd be literally putting your weight behind a political formation.
I do think so. It doesn't mean that there shouldn't be a dialogue. I think it doesn't matter who wins. There will have to be a dialogue between civil society and whoever is governing. If you look at our local governments, there's so many communities that is struggling with, service provision. How many how many of our societies are still sitting without electricity, without running water, without proper sanitation? Our kids, are there enough schools and all of that? So there will always have to be dialogue between whoever, wins the elections, whoever is the ruling party, whoever is in government, and civil society, because ultimately, and I think I can speak on behalf of the majority, but at the very least speak on behalf of my organization, is that, ultimately it is about good conversation and trying to convince, trying to advocate for what is right. And if dialogue doesn't work, then obviously you need to take other routes. So I do believe in a good conversation. I do believe if both parties, whether you agree or not, come to the table and can agree what is right for the community, for the people of South Africa, then that conversation would have been worth it. For civil society to go into the political space, I think that's something you need to decide because you change your mandate. Because I do think civil society has got a role to play, and there's a role for politics. Now, I can sit here and say, I think politicians are a necessary evil. That's probably exactly what they are. They have a job to do. Yeah. And then government has got a job to do. So questioning is part of what we do, and standing up for what is right is part of what we do. But that doesn't mean you have to stop all conversations with political parties.
Let's stick with those rather sticky questions that are very difficult to answer. But how effective has civil society been in playing their role, which others say is to reduce election-related conflict and promote peaceful electoral environment? You saw, for example, with a particular ad of the Democratic Alliance, people then writing, say, where's civil society? Why are they not coming up to condemn this burning of the flag and so on and so forth? We saw some instances where some political parties' vehicles would have been attacked on the campaign trail. We saw some gazebos being torn and so on and so forth. And saying, where is civil society in playing its effective role in managing those dynamics?
I think civil society's role specifically in this, on the road to the elections, is to advocate for the fact that we are a democratic country. You have a right to vote. So please go and vote. Please, show who you think should be running the country. If you were happy with the past, years, whatever, you have a democratic right, a right that has been fought for. Like I said, young democracy, there's quite a few things that we need to work on, but you have that right. Civil society has been vocal in saying that we need the ethical leaders, not just in government, but also in political parties, to make sure that we do not see the violence, that we do not see unrest, making it impossible for people, for example, to go and vote. We, civil society, and specifically, I think, over the weekend, by Defend Our Democracy, who had that media statement, appealing to, political party leaders that should not incite violence, but make sure that their loyal supporters do not, create violence or instill violence, making sure that people do not go vote. At some point, one can advocate for certain things, but the responsibility is not just on civil society. I think one of the things we need in South Africa is this concept of ethical leadership, the political will in order to effect change that will create a better working South Africa for all, and that we need to see that ethical leadership. Now, as civil society, we can advocate for that. But I think the duty lies with the political leaders to make sure, or community leaders to make sure. So in that sense, yes, as leaders of the community, you need to make sure that you set the right example. I just have to say, everything can't be on the shoulders of civil society. I think there's so many civil society groups and community groups that has come together. If you just think that I I hate to think how many kids go to bed hungry, and that if it wasn't for civil society, if it wasn't for those entrepreneurial women in neighborhoods, or men in certain communities that sort of starts these types of businesses by creating aftercare for children, food for children. If it wasn't for civil society, because of corruption and because the economy is where it is, and that government can't fulfill all the roles, is that civil society played an enormous role to try and ensure that that humans as a social being needs what they need, and in order to give what is needed, because sometimes government fails, and there's, due to corruption, just not enough to go around. And I have to say that if it wasn't for civil society, I think this ship would have sank further down than it is currently.
What are the implications? You've already mentioned the promises, at least that have been made in the last week. You're saying we would have a much better South Africa if any of these were actually put in place. But what are the implications when you look at underlying strategies and tactics that political parties have used to endear themselves? For example, around immigration. You are looking at tax abuse, so around promises that they're making around grants. We saw, for example, a pushback from civil society when the president signed the NHI bill. We saw pushback from civil society when Premier of Gauteng, Panyaza Lesufi, introduces wardens, introduces Nasi Spani, and all these things. People saying, no, these are just campaigning strategies.
I wonder how many people, all of a sudden, their roads have been paved. In the, there's some of the potholes has been filled. I think some communities are very lucky in that. I think that there was really last minute work to be done. All these legislations, I hate always, criticizing, but one has to ask. For example, the NHI, the timing of a lot of these legislation is questionable, and I think rightly so. I don't think it's unfair to question an NHI, which even the Minister of Finance has said, we do not have the funds to do this. So what do you create? You create a false hope that someone will have proper medical care very soon. Now, hopefully, universal health care will be a priority for the government of the day. But if you just think at our current health crisis, the fact that if you go to a state hospital, will you get the care that you need? One wonders, to what extent we have the ability to deal with, NHI and that type of funding. If you think about Babita, who, her killers are in court, but the corruption that she exposed, how far are we in holding those people to account? And again, it's not always making sure that people goes to prison. It is about the, again, that ethical leadership. How many of the people that were exposed during state capture are actually still sitting in Parliament? Some of them, committee chairpersons. So, the promises before an election, we will never escape that. I just hope that people realizes that is probably their a job to do, to say, we are the greatest, we will be the saviors, we will give you jobs. Creating jobs in South Africa will give dignity to so many people. But creating jobs also mean that you need to fix our economy. By fixing our economy, some of it is, for example, creating an environment for businesses to flourish. Now, how many regulations, how many attempts have we seen to create an environment where businesses can create jobs? We can't create jobs in government. Government's salary bill is too high as it is. And to create jobs in government is not creating jobs for South Africans. It is about, creating that environment where our economy can flourish, and that there's entrepreneurs that can start new businesses, etc., etc. Now, that is all, good said and done. So many political and, people analyzing all these types of things have said it. But we need to move in that direction. So to come back to the promises, we're going to eradicate corruption. We're going to do this, crime. But talk is cheap. And I think somewhere along the line, I probably can't say that from all politicians, but, from my perspective, there's always talk is cheap but implementation is the hard part. And I think we haven't seen the implementation part. And that is where people need to realize that each and every one of us has got the power, and some of that lies in election. We need to understand that politicians are not there in order to fulfill promises to the political party. It is about fulfilling the promises for South Africa and its people. And that is what, leaders need to instill, but leaders need to show us. So in terms of promises, I actually don't listen anymore, because proof is in the pudding. You need to show me the ability in order to look after our economy, education, health, all the important stuff, and our safety.
There is a degree of what civil society needs to do, which has got to do with restraining the abuse of power, especially when you come from a dictatorship, which, of course, is not what we're living under in South Africa. We're living under a democratic dispensation. How do you strike a balance between the language that we're hearing, for example, from some parties, especially when you speak of the question, particularly of immigration, that civil society is attacking the authority of the state instead of really restraining the abuse of power?
Again, it's probably a matter of opinion. We have the concept of free speech, but we also have a beautiful constitution with so many rights. So if you think about immigration, is that, we are South Africa and we, for example, part of Africa. I think it would be extremely inhumane, unconstitutional to say, we close our borders. No one is coming in. But there's nothing wrong with regulating, who comes in, and making sure that people are legally in the country. There's always a balance between, different rights. So you have, the rights of citizens, and then you have the rights of, people just visiting, but then you also have the rights of people that come from other nations to come and work here, come and study here, and in a bigger scale, when everything's going well, you actually want tourists. You actually want people to come here to study, because that creates an economy. So it is to strike a balance. And I think the balance that needs to be struck, part of that is civil society, keeping government honest to a large degree. Now, everybody's got a right to their opinion, but if you have an opinion based on facts and you are a defender of, for example, constitutional rights, I think that's your obligation to be vocal and to advocate for certain people's rights. And then for, government to turn around and say, but, it's not your place, or you're attacking me. I think if government should sometimes ask, am I doing a good enough job? Because will there be a space for civil society if government was acting 100% and everything was going, like glory? There's no problem. We don't have a problem with our economy. There's, everything. We live in a paradise. Would there be a need for civil society to be vocal about certain things? So I sometimes think in reality, is that when negotiations work,
Yes.
or when a dialogue works,
Right.
is when two parties come together and they're willing to listen instead of criticizing. And I think it's always, it is about striking that perfect balance between a right to advocate and a right to criticize, and government who needs to govern.
Advocate Fick, appreciate your time as always. Thank you very much for coming on and your intervention. That's Outa's advocate Stefanie Fick there. You can weigh in also on that conversation. 072-110-554. How do you see the role that civil society has played? Has been a healthy tension or a deep hostile one that has really sabotaged the, I suppose, the fate of some political parties? What are your thoughts tonight? Headlines at top of the hour. Stay with us.